deficits and thereby debt levels. Throughout the world, the degree to which these are binding is greatly variable, and in New Zealand, the Public Finance Act is not hugely binding. And for that reason, I think that one could describe the success of it in keeping our government debt levels quite low is arguably due to cross-party support for those low debt levels rather than the Public Finance Act as such. The economic rationale is in general fiscal credibility and discipline, and but I think you have to remember the focus here, and Bryce made the same point, is on testing new revenue and spending, and only secondarily about the adequacy of government services. It's often advocated for ideological reasons, smaller government. We've got technology problems here, and there are problems which we'll come to with simple targets to meet highly complex objectives. So to come to the immediate rationales that have been used in New Zealand, the first one, which I think is probably the more credible of the two, is pro-cyclical fiscal policy during growth periods. There's a concern there regarding the lock-in of structural increases in spending during those growth periods. And the example is given of the significant increases in core Crown expenses in that period, 2004 to 2009. And it's clear, I think, after the event that action was needed to prevent long-run deficits as a result of those increases in those structural increases in spending. The spending cap is advocated as a way to stop it recurring. But I think if you look at that record over that period, and the blue line there is government government expenditure as a percentage of GDP over the period 1999 to 2011. You'll see that in that period, around 1999 2000 to 2008, in fact, government expenditure government spending as a proportion of GDP barely changed. The big increase actually happened in 2009. As a percentage of GDP, and that was due to a number of reasons, some of which I'll come to, but partly obviously the global financial crisis that led to a very substantial drop in our GDP. Over that period, government debt fell quite considerably, so there was success there, substantial and quite remarkable success in controlling government debt. The second problem is the problem of how to tell whether the spending is structural. And this graph here comes from our commentator here, and Marie, and it was given to a conference in 2011. The advice to the government of the day was that its fiscal policy was counter-cyclical. And what you see here, I won't go into detail on this graph, but really the advice is the sweet spots, all our other things being equal, in this top right-hand quadrant or in the bottom left-hand quadrant. And what you see there in the red dots are the advice given at the time to those governments at the time of the respective budgets, was that they were counter-cyclical. They were in that sweet spot. It was only later, when we see these blue dots here, that it was discovered, if you like, after seeing how the economy turned out, that they were in fact pro-cyclical. And this problem with forecasting is an international one. It's not something that our Treasury isn't good at it. It's that it's part of the problem of economic forecasting. So the question is this one case sufficient to justify a change in the rules? The projections ex post indicate that a correction was needed for fiscal sustainability, but actually, in fact, in this case, in the event, the large increase in spending for 2009 could well have been just what was needed to cope with the very significant downturn of the global financial crisis. And in practice, the turnout, the actual spending over 2009 was 2.1 billion more than even that very large increase that was forecast in the budget. But the question is the spending cap the way to deal with that? There are choices for correction on both sides, both in expenditure and revenue, as well as the timing of that correction. So governments and electors have a valid political choice which route to follow. The second immediate rationale in New Zealand for a spending cap is smaller government. and that rests on claims that smaller government improves GDP growth. Treasury wrote a thoughtful paper in 2011, produced a thoughtful paper in 2011 called Does Size Matter? And it reviewed the various studies on the relationship between GDP growth and size of government and concluded there were very mixed results from those studies. It concluded that quality of spending and revenue are the critical elements. It defined quality in that paper, and I'll come back to this, in terms of economic growth. So quality spending was spending that improved economic growth, and showed that New Zealand's spending compares well with the rest of the OECD. So we're higher in areas such as education and health, and in general improve economic growth. We're lower, and quite considerably lower in fact, in the transfers area in social spending. It's something that probably would surprise most New Zealanders. And so this chart here, I think, is kind of a bit of a summary. You see here the bars are the percentage of government expenditure, the government expenditure as a percentage of GDP for the smaller countries in the OECD, the ones roughly is a similar size to New Zealand in GDP. They're in the order of GDP per capita, so in order, a rough order of income for those, or how rich those countries are. And you'll see there in green New Zealand. You can only just see, you can see the small country average there. So you can see that New Zealand is actually significantly smaller, as a significantly smaller government as a percentage of GDP than the small country average. And of course, GDP is not the only or necessarily the best measure of a country's welfare, of its well-being. And what I've drawn up here is one possible measure, which is the Gallup Happiness Index. And what you see here is a fairly typical thing, that it rises with increasing income and then tops out. It actually tops out around this group here of countries with quite high government expenditure. Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, over here Norway as well, quite high. So I'm not saying here that high government expenditure automatically leads to happiness, but I'm saying that there's actually a number of paths to happiness here, and to say that low government expenditure is necessarily best is as silly as saying that high government expenditure is necessarily best. There are also efficiency issues. If an activity is demonstrably more efficiently carried out by a government, the economy may be better off even though the government size increases. It's fairly self-evident. An example is health. The OECD in 2009 told the US Congress, in fact, that in the United States health expenditure is almost 2.5 times the OECD average, includes much greater private expenditure than the rest of the OECD, but overall health outcomes are below average in the United States. And they provide this graph. The grey areas at the top are private expenditure. The areas at the bottom are public expenditure, and you see in the United States there with vastly higher public expenditure per capita than the rest of the OECD, and much more of it private. The average is here, and there's New Zealand over here. It can also be true that government can be too small, and that's arguably true of the 1990s. We had, and I'll leave you to read these in more detail over here, but large increases in poverty and ill health, especially among beneficiaries and children developed over that decade. Multiple regulatory failures, many of which we're only seeing coming to roost now. Under-provision of infrastructure, well documented. Public service failures, with the number of employees halved over that period. An example that is well known is the Cave Creek disaster with 14 deaths, and the judge who conducted the inquiry to that put down as one of the root causes, inadequate resourcing. In Colorado, which Bryce has mentioned, they have a well-known cap on expenditure, and that's been documented to have led to worsening health indicators such as prenatal care and immunisation, lower spending, lower attendance in childcare, lower school funding increases and expenditure than the rest of the United States, most of the rest of the United States, higher dropout rates, and poor maintenance of infrastructure. After the 2001 recession, Colorado found itself unable to recover from it properly, and in fact partially suspended the cap for 5 years. So governments must be able to rectify past under-resourcing, and an expenditure cap makes that difficult. The global financial crisis again demonstrated the need for active government to stabilise capitalist economies. There is a need for an existing human and institutional infrastructure to conduct the stabilisation of an economy and a financial system. It demonstrated the need for stronger regulatory functions. It showed that the cost, and many other examples show this, that the cost of light-handed performance regulation that was in favour over leading up to that period is more and more sophisticated regulators, which cost money. And governments took over, as we know, some aspects of the private sector. The Christchurch earthquake also demonstrated the need for that human and institutional infrastructure to cope with natural disasters. In addition, governments face a growing number of global commons issues, such as climate change, which national governments need to cope with. So government objectives are not only or even mostly about the economy. So turning now to some specific problems with a cap. So first of all, recessions, and this is a major concern. Spending needs obviously may be much greater during a recession, and the OECD in its 2009 report on New Zealand, which Bryce has referred to as favouring a cap for New Zealand, said that in severe downturns the rule would have to be temporarily suspended. The IMF has estimated that for the G20, the group of 20 countries, the G20, fiscal measures in 2009 to respond to the global financial crisis averaged 2% of GDP, which in New Zealand terms would be about $3.7 billion, or a 7% increase in government expenses subject to the proposed cap. The proposed cap allows an increase of only CPI plus population growth, but and that would have allowed only a 4.2% increase. That's compared to the 7% increase, but that's including all other expenses that a government normally must cope with from year to year. So it would clearly have been inadequate in those terms. The proposed design provides an exclusion for unemployment benefits and for finance charges. However, as I'll show in a minute, not only unemployment benefits increase during the recession, other benefits do as well. And it also excludes capital expenditure and spending outside core government. So, but the types of spending that are required in a recession may actually be in a different order from that, and different priorities. So operational spending may be better than capital spending, which may be better than tax cuts. So it actually privileges spending which are not necessarily the best stimulatory measures. Here's an estimate I made of the effect of the cap. So in red there is, or brown is the actual expenditure subject to the cap. The green is what the cap would have allowed. And you can see there that for both 2009 and 2011, a government would have had to quite substantially cut its expenses, very likely leading to a deepened effect of recession, higher unemployment and so on. And if we look at expenses in